gonna get in hot water for this one probably,
Uh-oh.
but it's Bringing Down the House from 2003, starring Queen Latifah, Steve Martin, Eugene Levy, directed by Adam Shankman. Quick logline: when a lonely guy meets a woman on the internet who happens to be in prison, she breaks out to get him to prove her innocence and proceeds to work havoc on his middle class life. I guess that's pretty accurate.
That is the movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is basically the movie.
So this is on my list because I think you and I, we lived through this era of like raunchy, kind of inappropriate comedies from the 90s and 2000s, and
Yep.
this is that. And I
Yep.
think movies like this don't exist anymore at all.
Hmm.
And it's still, there are moments in this movie that are very cringeworthy and hard to watch. But I don't know. I want to believe that the people who made this movie and are in it are kind of in on it. And in some ways, it's if you look at it in a very objective way, this movie would be totally canceled right now, wouldn't be made.
Right,
But
right, right.
I think if you zoom out and sort of really approach it from that, yeah, people are in on it, and there is comedy, if you will, just as it is comedy in death and some of the
Hmm.
horrible things that we as humans go through. There is comedy in racial classes and the stereotypicalness of things, even though it's heightened to a 2 million.
Hmm.
There's comedy in that, so I think that's why I love it. And the fact these two are incredible, and the supporting cast with, I didn't mention Joan Plowright, who,
Oh,
I
right. Yeah.
mean, yeah, that song on the table, and yeah. Anyway, but had you watched this movie before?
No, I had not. I had not
Oh.
seen it. Yeah, yeah. I like Steve Martin, like we mentioned in
Mhm.
previous episodes, though it was after his late 90s career. After that, I kind of stopped following his
Mm.
career very closely. And I as we've talked about in the a previous episode where we covered The Last Holiday with Queen Latifah, I'm not at all any fan of hers. She never works for me, so that's why I hadn't
Yeah.
seen this before. And yeah, this movie was pretty shocking, to be honest, that this was made and especially so recently. I mean, it's not like made in 1942, that it was so casually racist. Like the entire plot hinges on
Mm-hmm.
basically, oh my God, there's a black woman in my house.
Mm-hmm.
And then, oh my God, we have to hide the black woman, hide the black woman, hide the black woman is sort of where
Mm-hmm.
the comedy comes from. And yeah, maybe if it was a different star that I found was more funny, the comedy would kind of work for me more in terms of the Queen Latifah side. But it definitely was a cultural a time capsule. In the same way we were just talking
Yeah.
about with Crossroads with the clothes, this was more about like, oh yeah, like we could have a movie that basically centered on like, oh no, he's with potentially like dating a black woman. How horrible is this? And his ex-wife is like freaking out because he might just be with just a black woman. I mean, it wasn't like
Right.
they knew she was a criminal, right? That wasn't, it was like, oh no, he's dating an ex-con. It's like, oh my God, he's dating a black woman. This is so scandalous. And but I to your point though, it's not wasn't mean spirited. It wasn't like they were the movie was like purposefully racist or anything. There
No.
was just a casualness to the racism because I guess it was again a product of its time. From it was a huge hit too, a giant hit, huge
Huge
hit at the
hit.
time. But
And
yeah, it was I was a little like shocked actually how
it is
much they kept
shocking.
going with this. You
Oh
know, it wasn't
yeah.
just like one joke. The entire premise is
The
a
whole thing
black
is
woman
that.
comes into a suburb of a bunch of white people. What's going on? Why is there a black woman here? Is basically
Yeah.
the movie.
No, it's definitely shocking, and
Yeah.
I had not seen it in a while, and watching it, now I was like, oh, this is like a lot. But I think that's the thing with comedy, right? That I
Mm-hmm.
think there intentionally or unintentionally there is some truth always.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is some truth here that in that time, maybe even today, in a neighborhood that looked like that, probably people wouldn't be saying all this, so out loud in this exact fashion, but
Mm-hmm.
probably they would be thinking it at the very least.
True.
And so I
That's
think
true.
that's the thing. Like, I think there is something true about this, and it's obviously ratcheted up to a 2 million, like I said, and they've kind of turned it on its head and made it into a comedy. But there is something subversive about it that, and it's a very careful tone, I think, because you're right. Like this movie, one step in the other direction, at least to me, becomes a racist movie.
Right,
That is totally unwatchable and is just wrong. And to each their own. I'm sure many people might feel that this is wrong
Yeah,
too, and I would not.
I kind of do, to be honest with
I
you. I mean, I
it's
excuse it
there.
for, I'm like, I'm not at the time called movie at the time, but I do feel, yeah, this movie
Yeah,
was like, holy crap, like
it
it's
is
crazy.
definitely
Yeah.
heading there, and I would not contest that at all for
Mhm.
sure. But yeah, I think intentionally or unintentionally, it does end up showing the truth in some
Mhm.
way,
Yeah,
and makes kind of a joke about it. Now, one could
true.
argue, should one be making a joke about it or not?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing to me when I was watching this, because there was actually a scene in the film where Steve Martin comes home, and Queen Latifah, who's again is his ex-con, who's basically tricked him into trying to help him be her lawyer, basically and get out of jail, where she brings over a bunch of her black friends,
Mm,
and there's a bunch of very very stereotypical slash racist sort of like black behavior of like, oh, they're all drinking, they're playing dice, and the kids are there sort of getting like corrupted, essentially is what the movie's saying, by the people in the crowd. And I was watching this being like, yeah, this is really uncomfortable as I'm watching this. But I was thinking, well, there was that scene in a movie we covered last year in our episode about money, Trading Places, that is
mm-hmm,
basically the same scene where Eddie Murphy
mm-hmm,
comes back to his mansion, and now there's all of his old friends, because the plot of that film is he's a homeless person, and these millionaires basically, for various reasons in that plot, give him a bunch of money, so now he lives in this mansion, and all
mm-hmm,
of his old sort of poor friends come over, and they're also doing a lot of the same things that were happening in this scene. Like they were drinking, they were
mm-hmm.
gambling, and there's prostitutes and everything and like that there. And I was like, why does that not bother me, but this does? And I was thinking, well, that sort of, at least the movies about class and race, and that's what Trading Places is about. Whereas this movie, I didn't think had that necessarily as a theme, or at least I didn't see that as what the message of this movie was. So I don't know, to me, like that's why the one scene, which is basically the same scene, is funny, even though you could say it's definitely racist. The scene in Trading Places, for sure, it's all black stereotypes, and you were laughing because of there's those stereotypes there, but there's a point to it, because that's the thesis of the film connects back to that. And for at least this movie, I'm like, okay, they're just doing this to get some cheap laughs, even though they're the same things. I mean, they're the same level of, if you want to call it racism or what have, stereotypes, playing around with stereotypes. But because there's not a thesis to the film or anything behind it, just maybe that's why it kind of just rubbed me differently. I also, to be honest, there was only one scene in the movie that I laughed at. There was a really funny part where he's talking, Steve Martin's talking to Queen Latifah, and or I can't remember actually who's talking to, and it's like, oh, they're trying to do like a sexy talk on the phone. And he's like, oh yeah, kiss me a bunch of times, and like that's as much as he can do. And that was actually like, I laughed at that. And the Eugene Levy stuff was funny, even though again kind of bordered on a little bit uncomfortable too. But yeah, I don't know, I
Yeah,
didn't really find the movie that funny, and maybe it's because I'm not into Queen Latifah so much, so it was only Steve Martin trying to kind of carry it for me. But yeah, I just thought it was
yeah.
interesting juxtaposed between those two movies. It just kind of came into my head. I don't know if that you remembered in that scene in Training
I didn't
Places.
remember, but now that you bring it up, yeah, it totally is. And I don't know, maybe it's the deftness of how it's handled tonally, and or how it's put together.
Yeah.
I mean, I find a lot of moments in Trading Places also quite uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
They use the N word in that movie.
definitely, and there's blackface and all sorts
Oh
of
yeah.
things in that movie. But this is a tricky one. There's no
But I mean, look,
question
it's
about that.
if the theme of this is guilty pleasure. So again, like I'm
Mhm.
not trying to say, the point of it is the movie you can't necessarily defend as a film. You just like it for some particular reason, which I think I read on this is you love Queen Latifah and you love Steve Martin, both in the same movie. And again, it was a huge hit at the time, box office wise. Reviews not so much at all, but box office wise, it
Box
was.
office wise,
So I can definitely
definitely.
see this
Yeah.
fits totally into that category for
Definitely
sure.
fits in that category. And I will say that, I watched it a few years ago, and I had a very similar reaction as yours. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like horrible. I can't even watch it. And then for some reason, I watched it recently,
Mm-hmm.
like 6 months or so, about once we kind of, came up with the idea of this episode, because I was thinking about it. And then I watched it, and I don't know, I sort of approached this movie a little bit differently,
Mm-hmm.
sort of saying that, okay, everybody's in on the joke.
Mm-hmm. Which
This
is
is the
true. Yes.
heightened thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, they are kind of uncovering a certain truth behind this, even though it's very uncomfortable, and in many, many cases, just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
it sort of made, I kind of went along for that ride. So when you have to kind of make that switch
Yeah, right.
in your head to then go with it, and then it does become funny.
But I think that's where the guilty pleasure part of it comes into it. Like some
Mhm.
people, if they're not doing that, then they don't, maybe again, I didn't
Yeah,
really
and
find
I
the movie
myself can
funny.
do it
Like
one
putting
time.
the racial stuff aside, I actually didn't really find it that funny. So it was kind of both of those things. I didn't think it was good, but it's a guilty pleasure. Like it's, I understood why, this is something that, cause again, you do love the stars so much.
Mhm.
Another thing I thought was very actually funny, but not like in the movie, but I found funny as I was watching it was just how, dated some of the things were. There was like a, Ozzy Osbourne reference because there was a
Oh
Ozzy
my
Osbourne like
gosh.
reality show, a Tybo joke, which I'm
Mm.
like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. And a funny joke was this whole thing about like, oh my god, that guy spent $600 on a cell phone, like he's crazy. And now it's like, oh yeah, like we buy $1,200 cell phones.
Right.
I was like, oh yeah, you just wait like 10 years and you'll see when the iPhone comes out and like $600 would be a freaking deal. Like that's a cheap phone now. Even with
Right.
inflation, I think that joke for some reason was really funny to me, or maybe just comment. I don't think it was necessarily even a joke meant to be a joke so much. And I was like, oh wow, yeah, what an innocent time we were back then, where that was a lot of money on a cell phone. Hey there, it's Alex. If you like the review and discussion Karan and I just had, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Movies That Shaped Us, to get full episodes. Every other Wednesday, Karan and I cover a topic around important people, places, events, and moments in our lives, and then explore it through 3 of our favorite movies. Subscribe right now, or follow our podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts via the link in the description below. Hope you join us for the journey.